Podcast artwork is the very first thing that your audience sees when scrolling through a podcatcher app. And just like the good old days of the video store box art, you want that cover art to stand out from the crowd and entice your audience to listen to your show. But if you're not Picasso, where do you start when trying to think about how to actually design your podcast show artwork or episode artwork? Don't worry, because today I've got two experts, actual professional graphic designers with years of experience who are going to help you break through that creative funk and start on the path of actually designing your podcast artwork. Doris Short is an assistant professor of graphic design at Slippery Rock University. She is also a 20-plus year professional graphic designer who has worked with massive brands like Hewlett-Packard and GlaxoSmithKline. Prescott Perez-Fox is a brand-focused creative director and designer and host of the Busy Creator Podcast, a podcast that features creative professionals who share their pro-level tips, techniques, and habits. So let's get to it. What would you say are some of the elements of good design that podcasters could take as they are applying it to their podcast cover art?
Just like any other design, if you design for print or you design for web design or whatever it might be, the first thing I think is very important to understand is that everything you do is part of a system. I would say simple, legible, something that's more pictographic, and something really important is also that it can be scalable. If you are not a designer, go in also and look at, there's some free templates out there. I rather want to have good templates than really bad design.
As someone who is a professional graphic designer and academic, how do you go about starting a design?
Starting a new design is, people tend to jump in with the look and the creative field before they really put the foundation down. And I always recommend to anybody that you gotta have some sort of direction. For example, if I work with clients, many times smaller clients, I always ask them and say, what's your mission statement? What is your company about? And if they cannot answer that, or if you can't answer what your podcast is, I'm gonna run 100 miles away from you and not design for you. It's very important that you think about your audience, right? So having what I call like a design brief or creative brief, it also goes and talk about, what is your audience, right? If you really need to know what that is. I would really do a lot of preliminary work up in front. I maybe would go in and do like mood boards or idea boards, like what other podcasts do I kind of fit into that category? That's choices you can make out there with a new design. Should it be a drawing? Should it be like a picture or photograph? What capabilities do I have? And then there's also trends, right? Go out there and look what other podcasts have.
So have you ever had to deal with creative blocks? I think that is something that just about every creative person has dealt with. And I think people who have never done any, graphic design before have probably dealt with creative blocks, especially when thinking about their podcast cover art. So in your career, have you dealt with creative blocks, and how have you overcome those creative blocks?
We all have them. It doesn't matter how many years you've done something, you get days where it's just not happening, right? What I tell everybody is, maybe drink a glass of wine or whatever. But if that doesn't work, maybe during the day, walk away, do something else. I think sometimes when we get blocks, it's because we look at the big picture. We look, we are not thinking that things can be broken down. Things can very much. And that's again going back to, let me go back to my design brief. Let me go back in there and let me take a look at what I'm really about. I would also suggest something called mind mapping. And that's a thing we use a lot in our creative field. It's a very powerful note-taking thing. It's kind of like a brainstorming session. And if you're sitting by yourself, you can easily do it. So I suggest people also to look up that mind mapping. get a couple of ideas, a couple of concepts going. Collaborate with other people. They might not be designers, but they have opinions, right? And I think that can kind of get you going. I think it can, right? But we all have them, and I think sometimes if it really gets bad, you just walk away and come back again, or work on something else, right?
What are some of the benefits of treating your podcast like a brand in that regard?
Yeah, well, here's the funny thing. I think that it's kind of become table stakes. You have to. This is a media production. This is a publishing effort that is going to live on for multiple years. And if you're trying to turn it into a business of any kind, or even a marketing effort for your other business, you have to be taken seriously. And that means coming to the table, coming to the setup with just like a basic level of professionalism when it comes to design and branding as well, in terms of strategy and writing. So it feels like to produce good artwork now is not really going above and beyond. It's almost just the default.
How important are technical specs when dealing with that creation of the podcast artwork?
Well, first things first, you got to follow the rules. So the album artwork is still square.
I wanted to point out one really important thing about podcast cover art. The file size of your cover art can actually affect your podcast feed. There have even been instances of people's cover art preventing new episodes from updating in podcast directories or outright breaking their feed entirely. So it's really important that you keep the file size of your cover art low. We here at Libsyn recommend that you keep your cover art for both your show and your episodes at around 500 kilobytes or less. Now, with that said, let's go back over to Prescott.
And if your artwork is not designed to be square, it will shrink to proportion, it'll squish, and it looks absolutely terrible. So that's one of the few things that all designers can agree on, is please do not squish your artwork, whether it's type or whether it's photography. It has to be the proportions that you created it at. So you have to think about a square, and sometimes that can be a little tough. If you're putting a person's image in there, like a face, that leaves you very little space over the shoulders to write text. Or if it's text, you might have a phrase that breaks in a funny way that you can only fit one word per line. So the square is sort of the guiding principle, but it's also the challenge and the parameters.
So what are some key things that you look for when you're assessing how effective podcast artwork is, right? Like, we know that it's definitely supposed to be that first thing that people see, because as much as we might think that podcasts are just audio only, it's kind of like the old days when we were at the video store and you see the box art, right? So what are some things that you see that are just like, these are dead ringers for things that really work and are effective with podcast art?
Yeah, maybe the biggest one is contrast, that we have to be able to clearly see the type, which is often the name of the show. And if there is a principal photo or icon, that should be also clear. So going with a very subtle tone on tone kind of screen printed look, like a 1960s album cover or something that's got tons of intricacy. Like, it may be beautiful for what it is, but we have to remember the functionality of podcast artwork. That icon, that square, is going to be reduced tremendously in actual practice. It's so small and it almost has to be immediately recognizable. It doesn't have to be award-winning in that moment, doesn't have to fill them with joy, but it has to be highly functional. Say, oh, I know what that is, I'm going to click on it. Most people still find their shows by searching. So they get a recommendation from a friend, they read about it in an article, and they look for a show by name. And usually they find exactly what they're looking for, but sometimes there'll be confusingly similar shows in the same category, right? So if you're in a category that has competitors or similar shows, that's where you need some visual distinction. And that could be done with color, that could be done with a photo of the host, that could be done with a sort of marquee typography or logo type. So you want to avoid confusion with something that's very close by to a neighbor. Your podcast artwork is not going to make or break your show. It's more of the sort of thing where it reinforces your overall brand and what I call the brand visual style. So folks will see your podcast artwork on a daily basis or, on their phone, but then they'll also see you on social, and they'll see your newsletter, and they'll see your website and your YouTube page. And if you go to a convention, they'll see your booth or your business card, whatever it is. they will associate that with you. It's more about recognition rather than a true reading and understanding of all the specific details.
So what do you think? How do you tackle your podcast cover art design? Let us know down in the comments section what your process is for designing your show's artwork. And if you like videos like this, do me a favor, click that like, subscribe, and follow button so you never miss a new one. Thank you again to Doris Short and Prescott Perez-Fox for taking time with us today to talk about the ins and outs of podcast graphic design. Check the links in the description as there are links to their contact information as well as their own creative work. And speaking of podcast cover art, remember that Libsyn does have an integration with Canva, which you can use to turn your podcast design ideas into fully fledged podcast cover art in a snap. Check out this video right up here with Dave Jackson as he breaks down this amazing feature within the Libsyn dashboard. I'm Brian Coddington with Libsyn, and remember, keep podcasting.